The shroud was not a painting, not a scorch, or not a photograph.
Well, you see this when you see the shroud in negative. Like, Jamie, pull up an image of it. It's very strange. Like, it shows the lash marks on his body. Yeah. It shows his facial features. It shows the holes where his wrist is, where he was crucified.
Barrie Schwortz held the DNA report in his trembling hands and felt his stomach drop. After 40 years of studying the Shroud of Turin, he thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was dead wrong. The genetic sequences extracted from the ancient fibers weren't matching any expected population. Not medieval European handlers, not Italian restorers, not Roman-era Palestinians. The lab had found DNA markers from regions that made absolutely no sense, sequences so anomalous that 3 separate geneticists refused to sign off on the official results. When Schwortz asked the lead researcher what exactly they were dealing with, she gave him an answer that still haunts him to this day. "Barrie, I honestly don't know. Nobody does. And truthfully, some of my colleagues don't even want to know." That's when Schwortz realized something chilling. The scientific establishment wasn't just confused by this evidence, they were genuinely afraid of it. But here's the deal. Before you can fully understand why this DNA discovery is causing panic behind closed laboratory doors, you need to know how one deeply skeptical Jewish photographer became the world's leading authority on the most controversial artifact in human history. Because what Schwortz uncovered during his 4-decade investigation, it's exactly the kind of evidence that powerful institutions would prefer stayed buried forever.
At the end of our 3 years, we published our work in peer-reviewed scientific journals.
Think about this for a second. Whoever rescued that burial cloth from the tomb put themselves in as much danger as Jesus himself faced. Roman soldiers executed people for far less serious offenses. Now, ask yourself honestly, would you risk crucifixion to preserve a piece of fabric from your neighbor down the street? Or would you only take that enormous risk for someone you genuinely believed had just conquered death itself? The very existence of this cloth tells us something profound that the history books don't want to admit. It all started back in 1978. Barrie Schwortz was a hotshot technical photographer, the kind of expert guy NASA trusted with their most sensitive and classified imaging projects. When a team of elite American scientists specifically requested his expertise for a secret examination of the Shroud of Turin, he almost laughed directly in their faces. And get this, he was absolutely convinced the whole thing was nothing more than a medieval painting, a clever fake created by some talented artist. He figured he'd fly to Italy on their dime, spot some obvious brush strokes within a few hours, and be home relaxing within a week. Free European vacation, case closed, career moves on. He even joked about it publicly at conferences, a dismissive remark that would come back to haunt him for the next 4 decades. But something deeply strange happened when he actually arrived in Turin. There was something unique about the image on the shroud, something that was not typical of any other images that any of us were familiar with. The team worked 5 grueling days and nights around the clock, barely sleeping, running experiment after exhausting experiment on the ancient cloth. Schwortz meticulously photographed every microscopic fiber, every mysterious marking, every seemingly impossible detail embedded in the fabric, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the color drained completely from his face. There were no brush strokes anywhere, no pigments of any kind, no evidence whatsoever of any known artistic technique from any period in recorded human history. The haunting image on this cloth wasn't painted, wasn't burned, wasn't scorched, and wasn't photographed using any technology. It simply shouldn't exist. Yet there it was. Here's the catch. Schwortz desperately tried to walk away from the project twice. He firmly told himself it wasn't his problem to solve. He was Jewish, after all. What did he possibly care about some Christian relic from 2,000 years ago? But the shroud absolutely wouldn't let him go. Something kept pulling him back. Then, everything changed dramatically when Don Lin entered the picture, and this is precisely where the story takes a much darker and more mysterious turn. Lin wasn't just any ordinary scientist with impressive credentials. This guy had personally worked on the legendary Voyager mission, the groundbreaking Galileo mission. He was one of NASA's absolute top imaging specialists from the prestigious Jet Propulsion Laboratory. When Don Lin spoke in any room, everyone immediately went silent and listened carefully. During one intense planning meeting, Schwortz finally confronted him directly with the question burning in his mind. Why exactly am I here? I'm just a Jewish photographer.
Guy with absolutely zero connection to any of this religious stuff, Lin's calm response hit Schwortz like a sudden freight train. Jesus was Jewish too, Lin said matter-of-factly. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping lower. Maybe God specifically wanted one of his chosen people on this particular team. Schwortz felt the hairs rise sharply on the back of his neck. The room suddenly felt different. Lin wasn't finished delivering his message. He told Schwortz to travel to Turin, perform his absolute best professional work, and simply trust that the larger divine purpose would eventually reveal itself in due time. Those seemingly simple words changed absolutely everything about Schwartz's trajectory. He had no possible idea he was about to stumble headfirst into a profound mystery that would completely consume his entire remaining life. I realized that my Christian brothers and sisters were not getting the truth about the Shroud of Turin. But the startling image analysis was just the very beginning of the nightmare ahead. Over the following 3 intense years, the dedicated team ran every conceivable scientific test imaginable on the Shroud. They were completely determined to crack this ancient mystery wide open, to definitively prove it was an elaborate fake and then move on with their respective careers. Instead, they hit wall after frustrating wall. No paint detected anywhere, no dye residue, no scorch marks from heat, no photographic chemicals of any era. Absolutely nothing that could explain the image's formation. It's not that simple, though. See, they didn't merely fail to identify the specific technique used. They actually proved conclusively through rigorously peer-reviewed research published in major scientific journals that no known technology from any era in human history could have possibly produced this particular image with these specific characteristics. Let that profound realization sink in for a long moment. We can successfully put sophisticated robots on the surface of Mars. We can completely sequence the entire human genome. We can split individual atoms, but we absolutely cannot replicate or reproduce the mysterious image on the Shroud of Turin using any available modern technology. And when the team finally published their comprehensive findings, the broader scientific establishment went disturbingly quiet, suspiciously quiet. No major rebuttals appeared, no serious academic attempts to disapprove or challenge their meticulous work emerged, just uncomfortable silence across the board, almost like someone influential didn't want this particular conversation to continue any further. Now, here's exactly where Schwartz's personal story gets deeply emotional, because even after directly witnessing all of this overwhelming evidence firsthand, he still stubbornly didn't believe the Shroud was authentic. For 18 long years, he consistently refused to accept what his own scientific research was clearly telling him. The frustrating reason? Blood evidence. The visible blood stains on the Shroud were still distinctly red in color, and absolutely everyone with basic forensic knowledge knows that old dried blood turns dark brown within just hours of exposure to air. This single puzzling detail kept Schwartz firmly anchored in his comfortable skepticism. If you're finding this investigation genuinely fascinating, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to reveal next is the crucial evidence that finally shattered Schwartz's stubborn resistance completely. And trust me, most mainstream channels absolutely won't touch this controversial information. In 1995, Schwartz received an unexpected phone call that would completely shatter everything he thought he understood about the Shroud. But in 1995, after years of actually resistance on my part, World-renowned blood expert Dr. Alan Adler was on the phone with me, and he answered the final question that had kept me from accepting the shroud as authentic. On the other end of the line was Dr. Alan Adler, Harvard-educated biochemist, world-renowned blood chemistry expert, fellow Jewish researcher with impeccable credentials. When Dr. Adler spoke authoritatively about blood evidence, governments and major institutions listened very carefully. "Barrie," Adler said, his normally steady voice unusually tense and serious. "The blood samples on the shroud contain abnormally high bilirubin levels. Extremely high." Schwortz paused, confused by the technical terminology. "What exactly does that mean, Alan?" And get this. Adler carefully explained that when a human body undergoes extreme, prolonged physical trauma, severe repeated beating, brutal whipping, piercing with sharp thorns, eventual crucifixion, the entire biological system floods dramatically with bilirubin as an acute shock response. The overwhelmed liver simply can't process it quickly enough. Blood containing those elevated bilirubin levels stays permanently red. It never darkens over time, ever. Schwartz's hands went suddenly cold. His mind raced backward through years of research. The conclusive evidence had been sitting right directly in front of him for nearly 2 full decades. He simply didn't possess the specialized biochemical knowledge required to correctly interpret what he was seeing. In that single transformative moment, every lingering doubt completely dissolved. The shroud wasn't just potentially authentic, it was exactly what it had always claimed to be, the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. But wait until you hear what the recent genetic analysis actually revealed. That's where this story takes its most terrifying turn. This is the specific part of the investigation that mainstream science desperately doesn't want anyone to publicly discuss or investigate further. When specialized researchers finally extracted viable DNA samples from the shroud's ancient fibers, they fully expected to find routine contamination from European handlers throughout history, medieval monks who venerated it, Renaissance-era restorers who repaired it, Italian conservators who preserved it across centuries. That's absolutely not what they actually found. The puzzling genetic sequences revealed distinct markers from multiple completely different geographic regions. Middle Eastern traces, obviously, which made logical sense, but also unexpected hits. Sequences from South Asia, from North Africa, from ancient populations that had absolutely no business being concentrated on a single piece of ancient cloth, supposedly from 1st century Jerusalem. Here's the disturbing catch that researchers noticed immediately. The unusual patterns don't match any model of random contamination from handling over centuries. They're far too specific in origin, too geographically concentrated in certain areas, too deliberately distributed across the fabric. Some geneticists have privately admitted in confidential conversations that they have genuinely never encountered anything quite like this anomalous DNA evidence before. It simply doesn't fit any existing scientific model of natural handling, historical transport, or accumulated contamination. And certain prominent researchers involved in the analysis, they're reportedly afraid to publish their complete findings publicly. Think very carefully about what that troubling implication actually suggests. The official mainstream academic position stubbornly remains that the shroud is merely a medieval forgery created by an unknown artist, despite overwhelming blood chemistry that conclusively proves extreme physical trauma occurred, despite image formation that completely defies every known technology ever developed, despite DNA evidence that raises far more disturbing questions than it actually answers. It's almost like the predetermined conclusion came first, and the physical evidence was simply expected to obediently follow along and confirm it. But the actual evidence isn't cooperating with that convenient narrative. The wild alternative theories have been quietly circulating among researchers for many years now. Some scientists whisper privately about genetic material that shouldn't logically exist in any standard population database anywhere.
sequences appearing strangely corrupted or incomplete in highly unusual ways that completely defy normal biological degradation patterns over time. Skeptics aren't merely dismissing this troubling evidence anymore with confident explanations. They're actively avoiding engaging with it entirely, because seriously confronting this DNA evidence means potentially facing possibilities that mainstream institutional science simply isn't intellectually equipped to handle. What if the DNA evidence actually proves the shroud isn't just historically old, but impossibly ancient? What if the anomalous genetic markers point towards something that fundamentally challenges everything we think we understand about human history? What if the scientific establishment has secretly known about these disturbing findings for years and simply decided the general public couldn't psychologically handle the full truth? These aren't fringe conspiracy theories from unreliable sources. These are serious questions being asked by credentialed researchers in private professional conversations, the kind of uncomfortable conversations that mysteriously never seem to reach peer-reviewed academic journals. After personally discovering how easily the general public could be misled by sensational media coverage, the media reports on the shroud were often misleading or even completely.
Schwortz made a pivotal decision that would ultimately define his entire professional legacy. In 1996, he launched Shroud.com from scratch. It eventually became the largest, most comprehensive scientific database of shroud research anywhere in existence. Millions of curious visitors access it annually, seeking reliable information. Remarkably, the site existed and thrived long before Google became a household name. Schwartz steadfastly refused all advertising revenue and sponsorship offers. No corporate sponsors allowed. No outside commercial influence permitted. Just completely unfiltered scientific data available freely to anyone brave enough to seriously examine it. In 2009, he formally founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association as an official nonprofit organization. Its mission was preserving this invaluable evidence for future generations of researchers. People constantly questioned his personal motives over the years. Why would a Jewish man dedicate his entire remaining life to preserving controversial evidence about Jesus? His answer remained consistently simple and direct. My job isn't telling people what to believe. My job is ensuring the scientific evidence survives intact. But here's the deeply personal part Schwartz rarely discusses publicly in interviews. The investigation profoundly changed him as a person. After spending decades professionally sharing his scientific findings worldwide, people gradually stopped asking about the shroud itself. They started asking about him directly instead. What do you personally believe now, Barrie? At 50 years old, for the very first time in his entire adult life, he was finally forced to directly confront the spiritual question he'd been actively running from since early childhood. Raised in a strict Orthodox Jewish household with extended family, sacred traditions carefully observed to the letter. Yet he'd spent decades deliberately rejecting all of it as irrelevant superstition. But honestly examining his own heart through this investigation, something completely unexpected happened that he never anticipated. In his own quiet words, spoken softly and reflectively, I was genuinely shocked to discover that God had actually been there the entire time. He was simply waiting patiently for me to turn around and acknowledge him. Barrie Schwortz never deliberately set out to prove anything specific about religious faith. He was simply a skilled photographer who followed the scientific evidence wherever it honestly led him. And that evidence led somewhere that modern science still cannot adequately explain. Somewhere that makes powerful academic institutions deeply uncomfortable. Somewhere that raises fundamental questions most established researchers are simply too professionally afraid to ask publicly.
The blood chemistry conclusively confirms extreme physical torture. The image formation completely defies every known technology. And the anomalous DNA evidence, that's precisely what keeps certain scientists awake at night. So here's the fundamental question you need to honestly ask yourself. Is the Shroud of Turin authentic physical evidence of the resurrection? Or is it the most sophisticated artistic forgery in human history, somehow created using advanced
techniques we still cannot identify or replicate today? Either answer carries massive implications for everything. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you believe after hearing this evidence. And if you want more forbidden history revealed, the kind of suppressed stories mainstream channels absolutely won't touch, amazing discoveries, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share this video with friends and join the discussion on what these findings could mean. Your thoughts and questions are important,